Okay, so welcome to this webinar where we'll be discussing citizenship and borders, which is a webinar organized by the research group Social Change Organization Management in Molde, and this is a new topic for us working on citizenship and borders. And we have we are very fortunate to have Matthew Longo to speak on this topic to us, and this is not really a new, it's a new topic for us in this group, but the question of borders have been around for many years, and it's been traumatic for some people, like particularly Kashmiris, Palestinians, and Kurds, and so on. But also we have a number of examples of people in just in this country, like the Samis, and also the Roma people and migrants historically. So, but what has happened over the last couple of years, and particularly since 11 September, is that we have had a proliferation of borders. And also during the pandemic, this has been played out. And we're lucky to have Matthew Longo, who's an assistant professor teaching political science at Leiden University. His book, The Politics of Borders, Sovereignty, Security, and the Citizen and the Citizen after 9/11, is quite a remarkable book. So, and it's a pleasure to have him here to speak. He won the Charles Taylor Book Award with this book in the section for interpretive politics policies in American Political Science Association. There are three things with this book which make it very valuable, and which I would like to mention just before we start. And first of all, it's a topic in border. He has identified the topic in political theory and state power, and he traces this to antiquity and also to the new border regimes after 11 September. And in this process, he has a number of nuanced readings of these philosophers and very stimulating observations about how there is collaboration on borders on both sides, also among enemies. So he's introducing new terms to explain about this. Then secondly, he has also a comparative dimension to this work, which is comparative. And methodologically, this is interesting because he, in this process, he's bringing states across the globe into dialogue with each other on aspects of state power. So he reminds us in this book that it's a global phenomenon. And the last point that I would like to mention is his commitment to political ethnography, and which adds very much to this book. And he's able to bring that data in with the human experiences and trauma into this discussion. And he's also been following this up in American Political Science Review with the need for using political ethnography. So, but today's topic is borders, citizenship, and sovereignty in the age of pandemic. So I think this is a very topical theme, and I should just give the floor to you, Matthew, and you should be able to speak right now. Yes.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for that introduction, and thanks to everyone for being here. I am totally sad that we're at the edge of computers, not in person, but this is the way of the world right now. At the risk of being slightly boring for Daguerre, who knows the book, I'm going to start by introducing the book a little bit, and then shift to the subject of pandemic. So the pandemic is going to be sort of an add-on, in the sense that I think that now all of us who have spent the last 5 or 10 years thinking about borders have had all of our thoughts begin to shift and evolve. And so I want to actually give you that evolution, about the way it came into the book, and then how it comes out vis-a-vis pandemic. So in that sense, I'm going to give the talk in a slightly different way than I normally do. I do want to actually give it as an evolutionary story. So with that in mind, maybe it's helpful to describe how I got into the subject. I was a doctoral student in political science in the US, and I was in political theory. That was the category I was in. And like everybody, you dig into a pile of books. And my particular pile of books were mostly focused on questions of cosmopolitanism, because that was sort of in vogue when I was a student. It was what everyone was talking about. I was in a program that was really interested in these questions of global justice and the questions about ways in which we can think about instantiating values across an ever-changing global terrain, so to speak. And I found myself quite frustrated with the ways in which borders were represented, in particular because they were always juridical conceptions. And I note from what Daguerre introduced that there are some legal thinkers in this group. And so maybe this speaks to you, but I was surprised at how much the border was represented as basically a thin jurisdictional line. It was expressed this way in literature on sovereignty, right? That this is the space where one sovereignty comes up against another, right? A sovereignty abuts a different sovereignty. It was true about transnational law, right? The idea that there was an international or transnational legal order that might transcend borders, by which is literally meant cross the thin jurisdictional line or erase the thin jurisdictional line. But what I was looking for as someone who had spent time traveling, but also to use the example that Daguerre just gave, I'd actually lived for a while in the Palestinian territories and spent a long time crossing, frankly, between Ramallah and East Jerusalem, but also in and around the West Bank. And you encounter borders everywhere. And anybody that spent any time in border areas or areas in which borders are not just existing but contested, the first thing you realize is that the thin jurisdictional conception doesn't help you very much. That there are institutions that have. So the story began by asking whether or not the theories, in particular of sovereignty, cosmopolitanism, global justice, transnational law, etc., change or are forced to change once you conceptualize the border as a thick space, as an institutional space. And so that was sort of the way I got myself going. And then, as Daguerre said, I wanted to actually do something ethnographic. I wanted to say, okay, well, if I'm actually going to do this for serious and not just talk about why I didn't like with the way the books were presenting it, I need to go. And therefore I went to the Arizona borderlands and very quickly realized that the thickness story was really the beginning. It was an interesting beginning, but it was just the beginning of what a border really is. And that to actually understand the way the border was changing and taking shape, or the physicality, the materiality of the border as a thing that's instantiated, I had to actually understand the ways in which it was developing, not just at the border, but through border makers. And that took me in the end to Washington, talking to algorithm designers, talking to people who were fitting cameras on drones, right? I mean, people who were making the algorithms that determined risk assessment at ports of entry. But also took me to marketplaces, places where essentially the state gives its vision of what a border should be, right? The state says, this is how we want to border. This is the border we would like in our imaginary to create. And they go and meet with industry leaders. Industry leaders say, okay, well, this is the technology we have. And between these two sides, sausage is made, so to speak, right? They suss out what the way a border actually is. They physically develop there in person, in front of you, and then apply it back at the border. So it became an ethnography that led me basically away from what I'd intended of just spending time in the borderlands into this mad dash around the US, but then ultimately in different kinds of marketplaces around the world to understand the way the borders were really developing. And that latter part of the story is relevant for what I want to talk about for pandemic in a bit, because ultimately it's this digital component to bordering, this idea that there's a kind of digital space or digital sovereignty that couples with the physical sovereignty that I think what pandemic is doing is forcing us even further and even more rapidly to grapple with. Okay, so that's the origin story of the project. What did I find? So in the book, I break it to, so I guess the better way to say it is this. I started to go through different kinds of biases I saw present in studies of borders. And I took as sort of a master cleavage, the distinction between ports of entries and perimeters. Why? Because the literature I was coming out of, that frankly most people in this group come out of, I would guess, or have at least read or experienced, was this sort of globalization literature, this euphoric moment in time where borders are being erased and the nation state was falling apart, and this crazy now in retrospect 90s texts. And there was this period that was generally described as debordering in the 90s. And the border was becoming a bridge, metaphorically. And this was met with, after 9/11, a whole other movement of what has been called rebordering. This idea, well, now slowly walls are going up. Think of Wendy Brown's book on Walled States Waning Sovereignty. And that was sort of described as rebordering. And each of these is a kind of expression of state power, right? And the ways in which the state interacts with its border. But what I saw in the former discussion, right, where the border was becoming a bridge between cultures and peoples, and in the latter, where it was quite literally becoming a wall, is that neither metaphor was at all helpful, in part because all borders of any sort, of any manifestation, is going to have bridge and wall-like features. In particular, perimeters, whether or not they have ugly cement and ugly gates to them, are ultimately wall-like. And ports of entry are ultimately bridge-like, even if they have very intense methods of filtration. And so the way I designed the book is to say, well, let's take this basic point, that if you know what a border really is, even calling it a border, a single institution, doesn't make sense anymore. So I started to ask, well, what does the perimeter look like, the wall-like feature? And what does the port look like, the filtration-like feature? And the principal argument I make about perimeters, the first half of the book, talks about the ways in which, as borders are becoming more porous, that was the 90s problem, and as states started to build up walls, which they immediately realized were ineffective, regardless of political rhetoric to the contrary, states and state practitioners, and in particular security practitioners, are all hugely aware of how ineffective walls are. I can't tell you how many, even the most hardline parts of the US government, like Customs and Border Protection, Department of Homeland Security, I cannot tell you how many people, not even speaking off the record, not speaking in private, you come and ask them about the wall and they're going to say it's the stupidest thing on earth, right? This is a political ploy. It's not a security ploy. It isn't a policy as much as it's a rhetorical move, which is why someone like Trump can exploit it, but that's a separate talk. But the idea that the wall doesn't work, so the famous expression of this, in the US at least, is that great quote from Janet Napolitano, who was the first DHS secretary, to talk about it. And she, I laugh when I think it's such an incredible quote. Now, in retrospect, now, 15 years later, where all we do is talk about walls in the US because of idiot Trump, she has this great line where she says, you show me a 50-foot wall, and I'll show you a 51-foot ladder. And that's the way border walls were understood. But so now you have these two problems, right? The 90s problem was that borders were increasingly porous. That was true sociologically. And the 2000s problem was that walls weren't working. They didn't do anything, right? And so now you have this new way of thinking that started growing at about 2010, in the middle of the Obama years, that actually what would have to happen, the only way you could do anything as a state to manage its periphery is to manage it with the neighboring state, what I call co-bordering, right? The idea that you move from debordering past rebordering into co-bordering. So the argument then becomes, and this is the part that became really global, I started to look around the world and found this everywhere. States are realizing that the threats to stateness, to statehood, are actually faced by all states alike. And so rather than see the fall of nation states as they predicted in the 90s, what you're seeing is actually the collaboration of nation states. And borders are ground zero of this. Borders are areas in which border guards increasingly talk to one another. They share information with one another. They often do joint stings and joint tunnel raids and joint helicopter raids, ultimately bordering even, so certainly in a place like the US-Mexico border. And I should caveat this, my background is in the US borderland. So these are the examples I'm calling from. As we talk towards the question and answer period, I'm more than happy to talk about borders in Europe, borders in Africa, borders in Asia. It's a much bigger subject, but because the US is where I did my field work, I'd rather begin by talking in this way, right? So the fact that if I told you now the US and Canada collaborated in this way, maybe you wouldn't find it that surprising, right? I mean, the US and Canada are allies. They're also rich nations. They're also predominantly Anglophone nations, and they're predominantly white nations. They're nations that even the most stereotypical treatment of what an ally would be in international politics would say, fine, of course, okay, they cooperate, who cares? But of course, the interesting side of the story is that the US and Mexico collaborate all the time in thick zones of commonality. We're talking up to 100 miles in each direction. That's a massive swath of country. I mean, I live in the country of Holland right now. All of Holland isn't that big, right? I mean, these are really thick zones in which both countries, both sovereigns, are ultimately present, right? They are co-bordering together. And doing that should immediately raise flags in terms of how we understand what sovereignty is. Sovereignty is meant to be a one-to-one conception, right? You can't have joint sovereignty in the classic idea of sovereignty. Sovereignty is by definition a story of supremacy internally and autonomy internationally. But also kind of reconfigures a little bit of what we think about global justice in the sense that suddenly there are situated populations subject to two sovereigns, but without corollary rights. In this case, we're talking about borderland communities, the people that live in the 100-mile zones on each side, for whom from the vantage of democratic theory, if you're going to have two sovereigns and two forms of security overlay, you should have two forms of rights. You should have rights in both polities. You should have democratic institutions that give voice in both polities. But it also changes how we think about some of the global justice literature, in which this binary of nation states or world state or international actor models don't necessarily become exhaustive anymore. And you can ask whether or not the kinds of stitching together of polities may ultimately be something normatively attractive, right? Now, in this section and the book in general, I caution against being too optimistic. I think the problem is, as you can imagine, whenever you have states aligning forces against mobilities, you should have a lot of concern of the rights of those mobilities, right? The idea that migrants are basically facing ever stronger forms of state machinery. And so the conclusion of this section of the book is something of the order that there is a lot of potential for something quite powerful in this institution, but there's nothing about it factually that we should find normatively affirming. In fact, what it is it's giving us a sociological predicate to start asking questions about new forms of federation or regionalism, new forms of sharing, different ways of emptying or opening the black box of sovereignty, and in particular, new forms of citizenship and rights. Okay, that's the first half of the book. That's what happens when you start to unpack the story of the perimeter. The second half of the book is about ports of entry, and ports of entry is much more deeply rooted in the question of data and the way the same kinds of decisions were being made about sharing, right, about understanding borders as collaborative spaces, but existing in the digital realm, about the data that our bodies carry within us, right? The use of, in this case, specifically biometrics, but biometrics in advance and coming from other countries' data collection sources towards determining who gets entry and exit into the country. Now, I talk about this in large part thinking about sovereignty, because that was sort of the vantage I came in with, which is to say that we think a lot about the question of the sovereign decision. Think about like Carl Schmitt, that do decisionism, the question, the idea that the state is the decider, to use a neologism from George Bush, a previously stupid president. And although comparatively a genius, whatever. And um, this sort of opens up new doors when you think about data. When you think that suddenly data is coming from alternative sources, and that the sourcing of that data is actually not verifiable by the sovereign, but the sovereign's using that data to make decisions, you can say in the end, the sovereign is the decider, right? They are making decisions over entry and exit, but the predicate of that decision is information that was never touched by their hands. And so I guess the conceptual strength of decisionism falls apart to me once data is understood to be shared and located in places that can neither be sourced nor retraced in most cases. That was one part of the argument. The second is that understanding the way that data sharing works at ports of entry, determining entry and exit, changes how we understand the kinds of global divisions, kind of global binaries we see in the world. And one example of this, I'm sort of going quickly through the book. I mean, obviously the book talks about a lot of different things, and the structure I'm giving in this talk isn't exactly identical, but I think it gives a sense of the argument. One particular argument I make in one of the chapters is about what I call the global firewall, which is that the ways in which data is being used by countries isn't exactly as you'd think. There's a way that people thought that data would just end up becoming a tool in a new kind of ideological division, a new version of West versus East, or the old binary of the US versus the Soviet Union, or these kind of classic global divisions. But in fact, I think something different is happening, which is that all of those national markers are falling away in exchange for better data, meaning that the enemy isn't the bad actor, so to speak, to use a very jingoistic American language for things, like the bad guy in this way that American border makers talk about things. In the past, it was the Soviet Union that was the bad guy, right? This global tectonic plate. And then it became Al-Qaeda, this idea of non-state actors and the post-global mayhem. And there was this idea that data would just mean there'd be new kinds of bad actors in the digital realm, or data would just be a tool to better suss out, to find the next bin Laden, so to speak. But actually what we're seeing is something slightly different, which is a new kind of cleavage based around individuals and their data clouds, meaning whether or not a person can be trusted has to do with whether or not the data network they're part of is trusted. So what you're seeing isn't per se a national division, or even per se an ideological division. Instead, what you're having is a division based on whether or not there are sets of people for whom there are digital clouds, digital records of their trustworthiness. And bad actors or risky actors are actually known actors. They're people they have digital clouds suggesting that they're risky. The new cleavage is just between people that have clouds and those that don't, those that are in the digital dark. Because in fact, the big threat that states are seeing or concerned with are the threats they don't even know about, because there is no digital tracing for them. And so this doesn't break down to national lines. For example, if you take a country like the US that has a very big, robust data network, you could be just as off the grid being a white nationalist terrorist in Montana for whom there is no digital record. And you might be in a country that we don't trust the data as much. Some country in Africa, for example, to use the classic US way of thinking of it, the most underdeveloped countries, areas, and yet be part of a data cloud in that country, right? So in this sense, it has nothing to do with where you come from. And this follows a longer way of thinking in terms of shifting what our security logic is in the country towards risk assessment, whereby national citizenships don't even really matter anymore. Classic example in America is that if you're an Arab American landing in a US airport, if you're an Arab and you touch down in LAX, you're more likely to be stopped than a non-Arab simply by being Arab, having nothing to do with the fact that you're also American, an American passport holder. More interestingly, the lot of you with your education and professionalism and your Norwegian passports, I don't assume all of you have Norwegian passports. In my mind, you all have Norwegian passports. Landing in LAX would be less likely to be stopped because of your education, because of your professionalism, because of your whiteness, and because of your wealth. And so actually, the fact of having an American passport is not the determinant of your experience at the border and not the determinant of risk assessment. That's a fairly old story now. This is basically since 2011, right? This is now 20 years. We've had data sufficient to divide people based on riskiness for whom citizenship is secondary at best. But the new story then says, once we know risky and unrisky, the risky, we know what to do with. We have a lot of resources in America and Europe and all these fancy countries to go at the quote unquote next bin Laden. The concern are the ones we have no information about, right? Those in the digital dark. And so that's a very, very quick tour of the kinds of arguments I make in the book. But to jump to the question of pandemic, we can go back and talk about other themes if you'd like. I just want to get it throughout as much as I can. What pandemic is doing is providing a new justification for a digital land grab, so to speak. Meaning it's allowing countries to say, just like we did in 9/11 with security, where we said, oh, all those civil liberties you had, don't worry about it. We, the state, on behalf of your security, we know best. So we're going to trade off some of those civil liberties for security, on behalf of security. That was a trade-off we made that led to, in the US, famously the Patriot Act. Across Europe, there are equivalents, certainly in the UK and France. I wouldn't know the example in Norway, but I'd be very confident in saying that similar moves were made, maybe not as aggressive as in the US or the UK, but certainly questioning how we can use data discovery and capture towards security ends, I'm sure happened there too. And that justification basically led to an enormous land grab, so to speak, on behalf of security against freedom or civil liberties or basic rights of individuals. What pandemic is doing is providing a second justification, now allowing the government to say, now on behalf of health, once again, for your interests, on behalf of health, we're going to take away further rights. What do those look like? Domestically, we've already heard talk about how going back to work might be predicated on proving that you're healthy. Who gets to prove they're healthy? Is it free? It's not everybody's going to have access to tests, and not all tests will be trusted. A lot of problems determining or distinguishing citizens in any register. Almost any way a modern state will distinguish citizens will end up harming, in particular, people of color and poorer people. But the same is true globally. You know, it's very easy to say something like, we as a country want to be careful who we let in. Okay, that's a prudent remark. And we already, after the terrorism rejiggering of our border idea, began to say, okay, well, people from country A are better than people from country B. We trust them more, they're less risky, so and so. And the concern is that what pandemic is doing is creating a new way to say, well, we trust people from country A, but not country B. Meaning, people from country A, we trust their data networks. We trust that when they say that they're healthy, that they are. And country B, we don't trust their data networks. So when they say they're trusted, we don't believe them. That logic is very powerful and actually quite prudent. It is prudent to say health matters for your own polity. The problem is when people from country A end up being rich and white and educated and generally desirable, and country B are Muslim, or they're brown, or they're poor, or they're something considered less desirable. Therefore, the legitimate or just form of filtration ends up ushering in horrendous kinds of prejudice and bias. I think that's the way we can learn from this evolving border story towards how we should concern ourselves vis-a-vis pandemic. Okay, that's the talk. That was about 30 minutes. And then maybe we open up to questions. Is that good? Okay, thank you.